G'day and welcome to the channel. Do you ever wonder why you get soft shots? Do you ever wonder if it's the camera? Is it the lens? Is it you? I'm here to tell you today that soft shots are normal, and I've been getting soft shots for 10 years. The key is to understanding why we get soft shots and what we can do to reduce the number that we get. That's what today's video is going to be all about. I'm going to share with you why we get soft shots and how to prevent them. So with social media, our feeds are filled with the very best shots photographers take. It's sharp shot after sharp shot. You'll see a shot like this hooded plover I took, nice and sharp, plenty of detail. And I suspect many beginners get frustrated as they look at their own images and wonder why they're a little bit soft and lacking sharpness. What beginners don't see are all of those soft shots that photographers delete. So what do I mean by a soft shot? Well, a soft shot to me is one that's lacking detail and sharpness. So you can see the difference between these two shots on the screen. They're both taken with the same lens, the same camera, same location, but the image on the left is what I would call sharp and it's got some good detail. But the image on the right is blurry, it's just out of focus, so the detail's just missing. That's what we want to avoid. So what causes these soft shots? Well, there's actually a lot more than I thought. Today I think I'm going to cover probably the main 7, so there are quite a few. So those being motion blur, camera shake, autofocus, lighting and exposure, the lens, heat haze, and of course post-processing. Let's have a look at each one of those in a little bit more detail. First main cause of soft shots is motion blur. That's when the bird moves at the point of exposure. So you hit the shutter and the bird's moved and the shutter speed's too slow to freeze the action. So there's some sort of blurry part of the image. And it can generally be very easy to identify because the feet or the perch will be sharp. Where the bird was moving will be out of focus. You can see with this superb fairy wren, feet in the perch are nice and sharp, but it's moved its head at the very time I took the photo. So the head's actually got some motion blur and it's soft. So a similar shot to this one, but there was no movement and the entire bird is nice and sharp. So when you take a photo, the camera will let a certain amount of light through the lens onto the sensor. And the amount of time that is called our shutter speed. So the longer that time is, so say you had a second shutter speed, that means you hit the shutter and when the shutter comes down, it's open for a second. And any movement in that second will be captured by the sensor and that often results in movement. So to overcome that, we need really fast shutter speed. You can see this Indian yellow-nosed albatross. To capture and freeze that bird in action, I actually used a very high shutter speed of 1/6400th of a second, which is just so quick. But that's enabled us to freeze the bird as it's flying across the water. If we're wanting to capture some sort of action without motion blur, I generally suggest a shutter speed of over 1/800th of a second. For example, this swamp hen jumping up with its wings out, this was taken at 1/1000th of a second, and you can see that the wingtips are slightly blurry, so we haven't fully freezed the action, but we've still got this shot. Compare that to this king penguin, and this was taken at pretty much as fast as the shutter will go at 1/8000th of a second, and everything is frozen in place. The water, the wings, the bird, everything. It's pretty hard to get a shutter speed this high. All right, the second main cause, and this is the one I probably have the most trouble with, is camera shake. That is, the camera is moving at the time of the exposure. And if the camera's moving, often the whole image will be blurry. So instead of just say the bird being blurry, the whole image is now blurry. This is often a bigger issue with long focal lengths or when you're hand holding your lens. You just can't get it as stable as on a tripod. So the reason this happens to me is birds are often moving and I'm moving my camera to try and catch up with the bird or frame the bird, and I'm just not creating a solid, stable platform when I'm doing that. So I'm to blame, but it's often you just can't get around it when you're trying to track a bird. So this is mainly an issue with slower shutter speeds, say under 1/400th of a second. At higher shutter speeds, it's less of an issue, but it can still happen. All right, so what's the best way to reduce the camera shake and the motion blur? Well, it's a combination of using higher shutter speeds and having a stable platform. If you use a heavy lens, I'd highly suggest either a monopod or a tripod with a gimbal on it. They just create that stable platform that enables the camera to be a lot more steady when you're taking a burst of photos. And when you're using long lens, there is a proper technique that you're supposed to use, and that's creating a few points of contact. So if you've got your lens on a tripod, is to have your face up close to the camera, so creating contact there, either your hand on top of the lens or on the foot of the lens, and holding it quite steady and taking the photos that way. Hopefully that will create that stable platform. If you're lucky to have a light lens like the new 100 to 500, you can sort of handhold that and keep it quite steady and not have an issue at all. So a technology that's getting better and better is image stabilization. So most cameras now will have in-body image stabilization, which means the camera is actually stabilizing. Combine that with a lens that has IS attached, and together they make a really, really stable sort of platform for shooting handheld or any type of shooting. And it enables you to use lower shutter speeds and not get those blurry photos, which is a great advantage. So here's some footage of me hand holding my 500mm lens without any IS. And on the right hand side, this is with IS and IBIS engaged. There's quite a big difference on how steady that image is. And the viewfinder actually is a lot steadier too with the IBIS. If you don't have any IS, the viewfinder jumps around quite a bit and can be a little bit off-putting when you're trying to take photos. The other technique I use is I shoot in bursts. So, when I'm taking photos, I'm just hitting the shutter and taking, bursts of shots, maybe 8 or 10 shots. Even if I get the odd soft shot, most of them are going to be sharp, and so by shooting in bursts increases your odds of getting those keepers. What shutter speeds would I recommend to reduce motion blur and camera shake? Well, for perch birds, I generally don't want to go any lower than 1/400th of a second. That generally works for me, and you can see with this silver eye, I had slightly overcast conditions and I got this lovely shot at that 1/400th of a second. With waterfowl or swimming ducks or birds, you do have to have slightly higher shutter speeds because they're moving, so I generally try to have a minimum of 1/800th of a second. And with birds in flight, they need the highest shutter speeds of all. And so to capture a shot like this wandering albatross, I wouldn't want to go any lower than 1/2000th of a second. To capture the behavior, you really have to have those high shutter speeds. However, I realize it's not always possible. Perhaps you live in a country that just doesn't get the sun we get down here, and you have to use lower shutter speeds. I get that. And I've experienced that a few times myself. Here's an Australian magpie that was taken in a very dark rainforest type scenario, and I actually had to use a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, which is very, very slow, but you can get sharp shots. I just never expect to get any sort of behavior or flying shot at those shutter speeds. All right, the one that we probably all have trouble with is the autofocus of the camera. If your camera doesn't focus on the subject, it's gonna be soft. I'll be honest that autofocus has been a big issue of mine over the years. I suspect it's a bit of user error and the camera and the lens just not being able to keep up. The other confusing thing is there's just so many autofocus settings in your camera, so how do you know which ones to use? I think it's just a matter of trying the different cases and picking one that works for you. Let's take a look at an example. I was photographing this coot as it came through the reeds. Now I've put the focus point on the bird, I've tracked the bird, I've hit the shutter speed was really high, I've taken a photo, and when we review the image, we see that the bird is completely soft, but the reed just above the bird is sharp. So for whatever reason, the camera is actually focused in front of the bird, even though the focus point was on the bird. And these are the sort of challenges and frustrations that I'm sure you've experienced. The subsequent shots after that were actually sharp, so the camera and lens have caught up and it's been accurate, which is good, and another reason to take bursts of images. I've really loved photographing sort of small shorebirds that move around quickly on the ground, and I believe this is probably one of the hardest conditions for your camera to operate in. That is tracking a bird that's moving in erratic movements all over the place. And I have to admit, my keeper rate is pretty low when I'm photographing birds this way. So for me, I generally shoot an AI servo. I have a high shutter speed and I have the focus point, either a single focus point or expanded, on the bird, and I'm actually tracking the bird as it's moving, holding down the focus, taking the shots, and I don't know at the time whether any of my photos are sharp. So I'm just tracking the bird, taking the photos. It's not till after the session where I check them that I'm either disappointed or I'm happy, and it's a real lucky dip to which shots are sharp and which ones are soft. And we can see on the screen, here's a shot of a redneck stint, focus points on the bird, but the bird's just completely soft. And then another shot in the series, the bird's now got its head in the water, it's feeding, nice and sharp. Then another one, the bird was coming directly at me, focus point on the head, but the bird's soft. So who knows what I'm doing wrong here, whether it's me, the camera, or a combination of both. I will say cameras are getting better and better at their autofocus capabilities. The R6 is a step above the 5D4 with the Auto Eye AF. It's just a lot more consistent in finding the bird, focusing on the eye and keeping it in focus. So what I often had to do on my old DSLR was I'd actually focus on the bird, take a couple of shots, and then I'd actually defocus on purpose and then focus back on the bird, take some shots. And I often did that multiple times because occasionally the 5D4, for whatever reason, would just simply miss focus and all your shots would be slightly soft, and it's highly annoying if that happens. So by focusing on the bird, then releasing the focus, focusing back on it, increased your odds that at least one of these bursts, the bird's going to be sharp. So I think I just do that instinctively now without realizing it, and maybe that's something you could try as well. So obviously the professional bodies have more processing power dedicated to autofocus, so it's going to work better. Some lenses will focus a lot better with their focusing motor. You know, the faster the lens, the better it's going to be. So there's a number of factors at play here that will dictate how well your autofocus works. Another issue I run into with a DSLR is keeping the focus point on the bird's eye. So obviously you put the focus point on the eye, and as you're taking photos, if the bird moves or you move, the focus point will move with you. It doesn't stay on the eye. So you can see here with this kookaburra, I've put the focus point on the eye, but I've moved for whatever reason, and it's actually grabbed the base of the beak. And because of the really shallow depth of field, the eye is actually slightly soft, and that's not what we want. That shows you how hard it can be and how easy it is just to miss focus. Luckily, I was doing that focus, defocus technique. The bird's moved, and I've actually caught the edge of the eye here in this next shot, and that one's sharp, and I was able to use that. I think the key to overcoming your autofocus woes is just understanding the limitations of your camera and being aware that you're going to have issues from time to time. So doing the focus, defocus thing, taking lots of photos, these will all help. But it's come a long way. If you have a look at my 40D, had 9 focus points, and compare that to the R6, which has focus points across the entire screen, you can see why autofocus today is just so much better. So another cause of soft shots on a DSLR is whether your lens and your camera are calibrated properly. What do I mean by this calibration? Well, on a DSLR, it's obviously got a little autofocus sensor which receives light and then tells the camera the distance to focus on. The camera will then send a message to the lens, which will obviously focus to where it's supposed to, or where it thinks it's supposed to. So you'll focus on a point, but if your lens isn't calibrated perfectly, it's going to focus in front of the subject or just behind it. So you can imagine when you've got really shallow depth of field, this can quickly become an issue, because you're probably focusing on the bird's eye, but the lens is actually focusing just in front of it, and you'll always have issues. I think a lot of people probably have this issue without realizing it. So modern cameras will allow you to make micro adjustments to change where the lens focuses, but I've found this to be quite problematic. There's tools like Lens Align, and you can also send your camera and your lens to the manufacturer to be properly calibrated, but it is quite hard. Luckily, I don't think I've ever had too many issues with my camera and lenses, but I know it is a big issue for some people. Well, I'm happy to report that this issue is no more with a mirrorless camera. Mirrorless camera works completely differently, and it actually uses the sensor to achieve autofocus. So once the image is sharp or in focus on the screen, that's when the lens will stop adjusting. So it doesn't matter if your lens isn't calibrated properly, because the camera will compensate for it. So in theory, if you're focused on a subject, your shot will always be sharp. I suspect this is why some lenses are probably sharper for people on a mirrorless body than it was on their DSLR, because it's always perfectly calibrated, and that's a massive advantage of mirrorless. All right, another cause of soft shots is just poor light. I go on about light, I mentioned it quite a bit in my last video, but if you don't have good light, the image just isn't going to be as sharp, it's not going to have as much detail, and it's just going to look a little bit soft. You can see that with these 2 spoonbill shots, both taken with the same gear on the same morning, but one was just taken a little bit earlier. You can see the image on the right. It's still a nice shot, it's still sharp, but it's just lacking that fine detail and sharpness. The image on the left, the sun's now up, it's a little bit sharper, we're actually using a slightly lower ISO, and it just looks a lot better. And in theory, your camera will focus better with more light. So if you don't have nice light, your camera will also often struggle to focus. I think one of the major causes for soft shots with beginners is overcropping your images. So when we start out, the bird's often far away, we take a shot, we want the bird bigger in the frame, so what do? We crop that image quite heavily to make the bird bigger. But when we do that, we obviously lose image quality, and it ends up looking just a little bit soft. So you can see in this comparison on the left here, the bird was quite a distance away, it's an inland dotterel, and if I crop in heavily, we lose all detail and it just looks a bit muddied and soft. I was able to get quite a bit closer in that same session, a bit nicer light, and you can see the difference here. Same lens, same camera, but the results are obvious. The image on the right is just so much better. So try and minimize how much you crop. Well, how do we do that? Well, we have to get closer or get more focal length. All right, that brings us on to the lens, and the lens is obviously going to make a difference to how sharp your images look. So as you know, I tested the Canon f11 lenses recently and the RF 100-500. The difference between those 2 lenses was obvious to me. I could tell just by looking at the images which one was taken with the 100-500. There's 2 images on the screen, one of them taken with the 800 f11, the other with the 100 to 500. Very similar conditions at the same location and roughly the same size bird. Which one to you looks a bit sharper? For me, it was the image on the right, and that's the 100 to 500. It just looked a lot better, and that's to be expected. So each lens has a maximum aperture. So my 400 5.6, the maximum aperture, is 5.6. So if I was to shoot this with an aperture of 5.6, that's wide open. To get the best sharpness, I need to stop this down. So one stop from 5.6 is f8. So ideally I want to be shooting between say f8 and f11 to get the maximum sharpness from this lens. And that's possibly one of the biggest issues with the Tamron and Sigma zoom lenses. A lot of people will shoot at 600 6.3 because 6.3 is the maximum aperture. And often those shots are just a little bit soft. I suspect if you shot at f9 or f10, you would get much sharper shots. So I'd highly suggest, if you can, is to stop down by at least a stop. See if that improves your shots. So this one hasn't impacted me that much, but it's definitely worth mentioning, and that's heat haze. So you've probably experienced it, but that's when you get a shot like this chat image where it's just a little bit wavy. It's soft and it's wavy, and it doesn't matter what you do or what lens you have or how you change, you're always going to have these soft shots. I don't know the exact scientific reason for heat haze, but when I've seen it, it's generally when there's a difference in temperature between the ambient air and the ground. So often on rocks next to the ocean, you know, if it gets really hot but the ground's cool, or over long distances, that's when you can get heat haze. I believe you can get heat haze in very cold conditions, so it's not necessarily just how hot it is, I think it's just that difference in temperature. And I don't actually know how you get around heat haze. Either you move location, get closer, or just wait for it to dissipate. All right, the last thing that impacts the sharpness of your images is just how much sharpness you apply in post-processing. So when you import an image into, say, a processor such as Lightroom, it actually applies sharpening to that image. I think the default on Lightroom is 40, and then there's quite a big difference between 40 sharpening and 0 sharpening. So this Takahe image is quite sharp, it's in focus. If we remove that, if we change that down to 0, you can see that the image starts to look a little bit soft. But when we move it back up to 40 or 50, it looks a lot sharper. So how much sharpening you apply will definitely change how sharp the image looks. I guess the key with sharpening is not to overdo it. If we go too much, it actually becomes slightly crunchy looking and unnatural and will introduce quite a bit more noise. So it's a fine balance. For me, 40 is almost always enough, and sometimes I'll even dial that down. All right, so how do we know what's causing our soft shots? I think the important thing is to test your camera and lens in the best possible scenario to see what is achievable with your kit. How do you do that? Well, you approach a bird that's going to let you get close. So it could be a seagull, it could be a duck. In my case, it was this double-banded plover. Let me get really close. I was shooting a couple of hours after the sun came up, so I had lots of ambient light. I've got a shutter speed over 6/40th of a second, so a nice high shutter speed. The ISO is quite low, so under 800. Have it on a tripod, focus on the bird, take a burst of shots. Theory, this is the best you'll ever get. So if your shots are soft in this scenario, that is you can't take any sharp shots, I suspect there's going to be a major calibration issue if it's a DSLR, or there could be something faulty going on, because you should be able to get sharp shots doing this. However, if I'm brutally honest, I think the majority of soft shots are user error and not a fault of the camera and lens. I know for me personally, the majority of soft shots I take are because of me, not because of the lens and the camera. And I just hope that this video gives you some comfort knowing that bird photography is hard, soft shots are normal, and we all get them. But by shooting in high burst rate, high shutter speed, keeping it nice and stable, you know, defocusing, refocusing, by doing all these things will increase your keepers, and hopefully you'll get lots of nice sharp shots that you're happy with. So I'd love to know if you get soft shots. Let me know in the comments if you take them, what causes them, what you do to avoid them. I'm sure plenty of other people would love to hear what strategies you implement to get nice sharp shots. I hope you've enjoyed this content. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. And of course, a big thank you to the members that support my channel directly. If you want to support the channel, have a look in the description below. I really do appreciate it. It helps me make more of these types of videos. So until the next one, take care, bye for now, and see you later. All right, so what shutter speeds would I suggest? I can't even say shutter speed. So what shutter speeds would I recommend to minimize, motion blur and camera? The camera has a little,